The situation in Ukraine militarily is pretty hot right now. I mean, they're calling it a stalemate. I covered it here last stream. They're calling it a stalemate in the Western corporate media, but it feels like the tide is turning toward Russia's advantage. And of course, we could argue that this was always the case, that Russia always had the advantage. For one, even the Western corporate media, I thought about covering it, but I decided that the article was too long, way too filled with propaganda. It was kind of like a neocon diatribe. But in the Financial Times, they even admitted recently that the so-called technocrats in Russia's cabinet, in Putin's entourage, while they regretted that this intervention, that this military operation occurred, they did everything they could to stabilize the economy, and it worked. So even the Financial Times is admitting that the economic war on Russia, which was really the key element to the U.S. and NATO's and the EU's agenda and its overall approach to Russia and weakening it through this proxy war, was really the economic war. Because I think that the United States and NATO understood that no matter how much they would pump weapons into Ukraine, that this military conflict would not lead to some kind of Russian collapse. That the only way you could get Russia to collapse is by having a total crisis, right? Russia's economy is damaged, and that would then lead to loss of morale on the battlefield. You'd have internal decay and unrest. Well, none of that has occurred, right? Actually, there's massive support for this military operation inside of Russia. There is not only massive support inside of Russia for this military operation, but the world has not really been kind to the U.S. and the EU in their economic war. You've seen the African continent, Africa, countries in Latin America. You've seen China, all of these countries. Well, some of them are neutral. Some of them are for Russia. Some of them don't even comment on it. But the theme is that the economic war is not very popular. So that's off the table. The situation is stabilized. Russia is not going to collapse economically. Actually, it's likely that during the next recession, whenever that should be officially claimed, we could argue that it's happening right now, but whenever that should be officially acknowledged by the financial elite, by Wall Street, by the speculators, those are the forces that usually dictate the narrative. Once it's acknowledged by them, it's likely that Russia's economy won't actually be affected in the same way that the US and the EU will, because Russia has done what I think any self-respecting country would do, which is to secure their own sovereignty through policies to protect their currency, policies to protect their oil exports and their gas exports, and their central bank. You hear this like central banks are so evil all the time. Well, their central bank has worked hard to ensure that the economy is stable, that there isn't this runaway inflation, that there isn't this runaway poverty and immiseration and unemployment. That's what Russia has done, and it's worked quite well. The currency is doing really well, and so the economic war isn't very popular. It only hurts countries in the global south, and so that was already going to inform the unfortunate military situation, and things are getting pretty desperate because you have now this intense fighting in Bakhmut that's been happening for days and days and days now. Ukraine keeps on filtering these soldiers, right? They lose hundreds, right? They lose dozens and hundreds, and then they send more. They send more weapons, and they're destroyed, right? There's this grind. They're calling it a meat grinder, right? This meat grinder happening in Bakhmut, where Ukrainian soldiers are just going down like flies. And so Russia is going to take Bakhmut eventually. Who knows when, but eventually that's going to happen. And you already see, I covered it here last time, Ukraine's military is already signaling the alarm. And you'll see in the New York Times article how alarmed they are. And that's why that they're spending all this money on this military budget to funnel it to the military contractors, try to get these production lines going. But there's a lot of hesitancy. There's a lot of hand-wringing and wondering, well, Is this a smart investment? There's a lot of trouble right now for Ukraine on the battlefront, and it's getting desperate. And you saw that desperation all along the way over the last several months. You saw what happened at the Crimea Bridge with Nord Stream pipelines, with the attack on, on the Black Sea, right? You had these false flag operations, these attempts to draw NATO in, the Poland missile. Remember Ukraine firing the S-300 missiles on a Polish village and killing a few people. It's only gotten more and more desperate. Well, one of the biggest and most desperate acts that Ukraine has committed throughout this war, and it's a war crime, no matter if there are casualties or not, Ukraine has been firing on Russian territory throughout this conflict. That's one thing they don't want to tell you. The Western corporate media says Ukraine is just fighting this unprovoked aggression from Russia. Russia is, invading Ukraine, and it's just a victim. It's this European democracy that's being invaded by this Russian autocracy, and Ukraine is a victim. Ukraine is the best. Ukraine is everything great. Ukraine is peaceful. It only wants peace. And then you find out that, well, Ukraine's military has been taking these weapons, let alone the fact that Ukraine's military is full of hard right nationalists, neo-Nazis, right? These fascistic forces, right? Downright fascists filled with them. It's only a little bit, but, every time the Western corporate media wants to do a debunk or rebuttal on this, they end up just self-owning, right? You just see, oh, well, the Forbes magazine, for example, say this was always exaggerated. But actually look at these new weapons that the Ukraine National Guard received. And, look at that insignia. It's a hard right, far right fascistic insignia. Obviously there's a problem, but it's not as big as Russia would like to say. It doesn't justify this, right? So that's how they try to fool us into believing that Ukraine is this perfect example of what it means to be heroic against an aggressor. Well, actually, Ukraine is an aggressor. If regardless of what you think of Russia, in my opinion, I don't think Russia is an aggressor here. I think Russia was provoked. I think Russia was encircled, is encircled. I'm using past tense here, but I shouldn't. Russia is provoked. Russia is encircled. Russia, just like a lot of countries now, that are feeling this way, it's like, how much more can you take? How much more can you swallow? And Russia said, we can't swallow anymore, and they decided to fight back. And that's what's happening, regardless of whether you agree with the fight back or not. To me, that's the correct framing. And when you have Ukraine's military actually hitting Russia's territory, well, you see that this aggressor, right? This aggressor narrative is so ridiculous because countries that are fighting, right? For example, if you remember the anti-colonial period, right? If you remember the, let's just even say the Korean War, right? So the U.S. invaded Korea in 1950. Did you see the Red Army, right? The National Liberation Army in Korea come to the United States and start committing terrorist attacks? No, that didn't happen. Why? Because Korea was defending itself from imperialism, from a U.S. occupying force. Not only did they not have the means, but they didn't have any interest in committing terrorist attacks abroad. They couldn't, and they didn't have any interest. So now we're seeing, well, Ukraine is getting all this modern military equipment from the West, and what are they doing with it? Well, they're committing war crimes with it. That's not what a country defending itself from an aggressor does. If you're truly interested in injecting a so-called aggressor or an occupier, well, you usually focus on the occupying forces in your country, not people in civilian areas in Russia. But you've heard Zelensky. He kind of dreams a bit. He is an unhinged puppet at this point. He does dream of Moscow falling because he believes that is what is best for his political capital. And so we're now in a situation where Ukraine is regularly hitting Russian territory. I cannot tell you how dangerous this is. It's really dangerous. And it's happening more and more and more. Okay. So, and it's deadly. So here you have RT reporting Ukrainian attack kills a man inside of Russia, says governor. Air defense systems have been activated over the area that borders Ukraine. Vyacheslav Gladkov announced on social media. So here you go. You have a civilian has been killed and at least 8 others injured in a Ukrainian attack on western Russia's Belgorod region. Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov has reported on Telegram. Our air defense system worked over Belgorod and Belgorod region, he wrote on Sunday. I need to work on my Russian. So I spoke to 2 of them at the scene. A man was wounded in the back while a woman was wounded in the face. The 2 children were miraculously unharmed, the governor wrote on his Telegram, and then he added that 14 houses and 9 cars were damaged. He said that 1 person was killed on the outskirts of the regional capital and another one was wounded. A poultry farm was damaged. So this is who Ukraine is targeting. Does this sound like a country defending itself from an aggressor? Look at these pictures. What did these poultry farmers have to do with the conflict going on? What do they have to do with it? It's just, this is a war crime, right? So Russian territories bordering Ukraine, such as Belgorod and Bryansk regions, have repeatedly come under attack since Moscow launched its military operation against its neighbor in late February. So, it's not a long report, but it's just to demonstrate that Ukraine is killing Russian civilians, right? And this isn't even to say what's happening in the Donbass, which if you just go to Patrick Lancaster, he is sick right now. Everyone wish him well. I wanted to have him on the program with Alex from Reportify. That's going to happen eventually once he is well, but he's in the hospital right now getting better. So wish him well. But if you just go to his YouTube channel, every single video is talking about it's all about going to a place in Donetsk, in Lugansk, where there are war crimes being committed by Ukraine's military. And this is against ethnic Russians, people who identify as Russian. This has been the case since 2014, since the so-called Civil War, which was really just a war of aggression to build up to this moment. That's what's been going on. So this is incredibly dangerous because you have now NATO acknowledging that there is a likelihood that NATO could be in a conflict. It could find itself in a conflict with Russia because of what's going on in Ukraine. And so NATO is now saying, yeah, this could happen. They're claiming they don't want it to happen. But who was it? Wasn't it NATO that allowed for an entire day after Zelensky in the Ukrainian military fired S-300 missiles on a Polish village, accident or not, whatever you think about it, accident or not, the fact is that it killed a couple of people. It killed children, I believe. And for an entire day, the Western corporate media and NATO said it was Russia. It was Russia. And then they had to walk it back. But they didn't admit they were wrong. They just changed the narrative. So don't tell me that you don't want war with Russia when this whole entire conflict was about building up to war with Russia. And we're going to get to how the diplomatic situation really reflects that. But the point here is that the military situation reflects that. We have to pierce through this propaganda that Ukraine is some kind of peaceful country that's a victim of aggression. This channel is about precision. This work here is about precision. Foreign policy, questions of imperialism, questions of war and peace have to be answered precisely. So oftentimes what you have in the Western corporate media is just narratives. It's just propaganda. They're just trying to tell you what they want you to hear, right? What they want you to think. They're not teaching you how to think about things, and surely they are misconstruing, if not completely distorting or omitting the facts. Or worse, they're telling you lies. Usually it's a combination of all three. And the biggest lie of this conflict, in my opinion, has been that Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression. That might seem far-fetched to say, but it's the truth. It's the truth. Ukraine is not a victim of Russian aggression. Ukraine is a victim of U.S. and NATO imperialism. That's what Ukraine is a victim of. Ukraine was already the poorest country in Europe. It's an Eastern European country, guys. Given the character of Europe, it's hard to include Eastern Europe in Europe. Why? Because Eastern Europe has been treated basically like neo-colonies, right? all the countries in Eastern Europe, especially the former Soviet republics, they're just neo-colonies to Western Europe. They're just countries that they're happy are no longer in the Soviet Union or aligned with the Soviet Union, and they're just countries that have been pilfered and plundered to a degree that now Western Europe is experiencing from the United States. That's kind of been the dynamic and the development. But the point is that Ukraine was already the poorest country in Europe. And now it's not only poorer, it's not only more destitute because not because of Russia. Well, we have to be honest. Russia's drone strikes, right? They've been happening. Missile strikes and drone strikes have been happening since October. 50% of Ukraine's power is down. Yeah, I'm not going to say that's not Russia doing that. Then that's not Russia's fault. But at the same time, the humanitarian and the economic situation is a Western creation. And the fact that this war is happening in the first place is a NATO creation. Russia didn't want to fight this war. And as you'll see, the diplomatic situation shows that that was exactly the case. And it was the West, it was Germany, it was France, it was the United States that wanted to build up to this moment. So Ukraine is not a victim. Ukraine is not a country that we should be saying, well, its leadership is heroic. No, Ukraine right now is leaving its people to die. Ukrainian generals are saying that they can't evacuate refugees because that will leave them more vulnerable to Russia. What does that mean? That means that essentially Ukrainian civilians are human shields. Ukrainian civilians are just agents of war. They're just meant to help serve the military situation for Ukraine rather than people who are suffering mightily from a government policy and from its puppet masters' policy of waging a proxy war with Russia, because that's the reality. So Ukraine is not Ukraine's people are certainly victims here. And honestly, the people of the world are victims here because it's all of us who have to suffer for this a proxy war led by the United States and NATO. That's who's really suffering, not the government of Ukraine. The government of Ukraine has gone all in with U.S. plans for the region and U.S. geopolitics and geopolitical ambitions and imperial ambitions. That's the truth. That's the truth. So Ukraine's government, if they were truly not puppets of the United States, if they had an independent bone in their body, they would be doing everything they can to help people, and they would do everything they can to forge peace, because this situation is getting bad. When you have to strike Russian territory, when you have to commit false flags, when you have to send bands and units of soldiers over and over and over again to keep tiny little towns in Donbass, like Bakhmut, when you're spending and investing all sorts of resources for one area of a large battlefield, it means that things aren't going well for you because Russia isn't doing that. So the tide is turning. It's coming soon. There's a meeting happening soon between Putin and Lukashenko of Belarus, right? There's always talks about in the Western corporate media about Belarus is helping Russia, and oh no, can there be an invasion from the north from Belarus? Well, I don't think that's likely, but what is probably happening is that there is discussions about what's the next phase of this military operation. Belarus has had some involvement in this, not a lot. Really, it's more of a security dialogue. It's more about, well, how do we protect each other? How do we make sure this doesn't get out of hand? But at the same time, there is something coming. There is going to be a winter offensive. I covered it here. There will be one. Ukraine is saying it. The Western corporate media is saying it. They're saying that they're in trouble and that there has to be a lot more investment to come in Ukraine's military if they're going to survive it. And now you have the diplomatic situation shifting as well. So Ukraine's in trouble. Ukraine is desperate. And the military situation is that we don't know exactly where things are going to go. We don't know how things are going to fall. We know Bakhmut is going to fall. Ukraine is not going to be able to keep it. Ukraine is not going to be able to win that battle. But it's not even just about that single battle. It's about what's to come. It's about the overall situation, the feeling that you get, and the understanding and assessment you can make when Ukraine's military has to strike Russian territory with its dwindling weaponry, with its dwindling Western obtained weaponry. When it has to do that, you know that things are not so stable for Ukraine right now. Things are not so stable. If you just watch Zelensky and listen to him talk, you saw that he got rejected at FIFA, right? He wasn't able to speak at the World Cup like he wanted to. You see this desperation happening, and you just know that this winter is going to be a tough one. 2023 is not going to be a happy new year for Ukraine's military or its puppet government. It just won't be. It's going to be probably a really hard and difficult new year, one that I think is going to signal a wind down and perhaps a new stage of this conflict. I'm not going to say it's going to end, because I don't think that the United States and NATO want this to end. I think that they're going to try to wiggle their way in, try to squirm their way around a peaceful settlement and figure out something else, right? And now you see even reports about how Europe's energy prices have not been as high as they could have been because there's just been warmer weather. Well, that's not going to last. None of this is going to last. And the point that we should take away from Ukraine striking Russia's territory is that it is not just some victim of Russian aggression, that it is being used as a pawn, as a puppet, as a military a weapon, as a political weapon against Russia in order to fight what is a bigger war, a war that the United States wants with Russia, a larger war, one that would be devastating. It would be absolutely devastating. And so that's why we have to talk about reframing, challenging, interrupting, disrupting, and ultimately debunking this narrative that Ukraine is just some victim here, because it isn't. The people are victims. The people of the region are victims. Russia, in a lot of ways, is being provoked and pulled into this and having to sacrifice a lot to do this. But at the end of the day, we can't call Russia a victim, because Russia is trying to use this situation to its own benefit, and it's worked to a large degree. So while I wouldn't say that it is some kind of that this is beneficial to Russia overall, the situation is pretty clear right now. Russia is in much better shape than I think anyone in the Western elite, the imperialist elite, could have imagined, and Ukraine is in the opposite situation. I wouldn't be surprised if one of the things that happens, even if this conflict doesn't end, is if Ukraine's government goes through some kind of transition. Is Zelensky necessarily someone that is needed, that is required? I think for a little longer, just because they invested so much in a propaganda narrative. I don't think it would look good to let go of Zelensky and say, now we need a replacement. But I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the next 6 months, Ukraine's government goes through a big transition. You even hear some murmurs about the military wanting to make that kind of transition because of how this situation has played out, the exhaustion that is playing out, the depletion of resources.